John had always been the practical one, the kind of person who believed that everything should be calculated, every decision made with precision. Claire, on the other hand, had always been more romantic, dream-driven. So when they found their perfect house, it was Claire who first fell in love with it. A sprawling Victorian home tucked away at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, with a large garden, beautiful old windows, and a history that could fill 1,000 stories. The price, however, was what really sold John. It was ridiculously low for the size of the house, too low to pass up. "Think about it," he said one evening, walking Claire through the empty rooms. "We'll have more space than we know what to do with. It's a fixer-upper, but it's got everything we need." Claire hesitated, looking around the darkened room with its creaky floors and dusty corners. Something about the place unsettled her. The house was old, beautiful but old. And the price? Well, the price was a mystery. "It feels strange," Claire said, her voice unsure. "Strange in a good way," John said with a smile. "It's got character. It just needs a little love. You'll see." The first few days in the house were filled with excitement. John and Claire spent their time unpacking, cleaning, and taking long walks around the garden. The house was big, too big for just the two of them, but there was a certain charm to it that kept Claire from feeling overwhelmed. But late at night, as they lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house creaked, groaned, and moaned with age. But Claire couldn't help but feel as if it were more than just the sounds of an old house settling. It felt alive, watching, waiting. And when Claire turned to John, he was asleep, unaware of the strange presence she sensed in the air. It began on the third night. Claire woke with a start, the room cold, the darkness pressing in around her. She tried to sit up, but the covers were heavy. The whispers began faintly at first, so soft she almost thought she imagined them. "Claire!" She froze, holding her breath, listening. The voice came again. Not a dream, not her imagination. The whisper was real, coming from the walls. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned to John, but he was still fast asleep beside her, oblivious to the voices that were calling her name. "Claire!" the voice whispered again, low and urgent. The sound was faint, but it was undeniable. Claire's breath quickened as she pulled the covers over her head, trying to block out the whispers. It was just the house settling, she told herself. Just the wind in the walls. But then, the tapping started. Soft at first, like something small and light scratching against wood, and then louder. The tapping echoed through the room like fingernails on a chalkboard. Claire sat up, her eyes wide, searching the dark room. She felt a chill running down her spine. "John," she whispered urgently, shaking him. "John, wake up." He stirred, groggy. "What is it?" "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. John sat up, blinking, and listened for a moment. The room was still. The tapping had stopped. "I don't hear anything, Claire. It's just the house settling. You're probably just tired." He rubbed his eyes and rolled over. But Claire knew it wasn't just the house settling. Something was here. Something that wasn't supposed to be. The whispers continued every night after that. Claire tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself it was just an old house with a lot of character. But then, the doll appeared. She didn't remember seeing it before, but when she went into the living room one afternoon, it was sitting on the couch. A small porcelain doll, its dress faded with age, its face cracked and worn. Its eyes were dark, hollow, staring straight ahead. It was the kind of doll that belonged in an old attic, not sitting in the middle of a modern living room. Claire stared at it for a moment, her heart racing. It was too perfect, too out of place. "John?" she called, but when he entered the room, the doll was gone. "What is it?" he asked, confused. "The doll," Claire said, her voice tight. "It was just here." John raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about? There's no doll." But Claire knew what she had seen. It was real. The doll was real, and it was not meant to be there. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, more insistent this time. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, Inside the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. And then, just before she fell asleep, Claire heard it. Quiet at first, but unmistakable. The doll was laughing. The whispers grew louder every night, and so did the strange occurrences. One evening, as Claire was exploring the house, she stumbled upon something that she hadn't noticed before. A hidden door beneath the staircase. It was old, with a rusty iron handle, and it seemed to be locked. Curiosity got the better of her, and Claire found a key hidden behind one of the paintings in the living room. When she turned the key and opened the door, the air inside the room felt thick with dust. It was an old closet, cramped and dark, but there was something more disturbing about it. On the floor, in the corner, was a chalk drawing of a girl in a circle, surrounded by strange symbols. Claire's pulse quickened as she knelt down to get a better look. The symbols were unlike anything she had seen before, twisted, jagged shapes that seemed to move the longer she stared at them. Then, she saw it. Beneath the symbols was a small piece of paper, stained and yellowed with age. As Claire pulled it from the floor and opened it, her heart sank. It was a letter, written in delicate handwriting. "I am trapped here. They want me to stay. I cannot leave. I can't get out. They're watching me. I can hear them in the walls." Determined to uncover more, Claire researched the house's history. She visited the local library and spoke to some of the older residents in the neighborhood. It wasn't long before she learned the truth about the house's previous occupants, the Baxters, an old family who had lived in the house over a century ago. The Baxters were a well-known family in the area, but rumors began to swirl around their disappearance. Neighbors had claimed that they were never seen again, that the house had been abandoned for years, and that strange happenings were associated with the property. It wasn't until she spoke to an elderly woman named Mrs. Keller that Claire learned the most chilling detail. "They were into strange things, those Baxters," Mrs. Keller whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "They were involved in dark practices, things no one should mess with. I heard they were trying to summon spirits. The house has always been cursed." Claire felt her stomach drop. What happened to them? The girl, Lila, she was just a child when she disappeared. But there were rumors she was locked away in the basement, that her father was trying to save her. But the house didn't want to let her go. It had been 2 weeks since Claire found the hidden room in the letter, and in that time, things had only gotten worse. The house had become unbearable. Every night the whispers became louder, clearer, like they were speaking directly into her ears. She couldn't sleep anymore. She would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the relentless murmurings coming from the walls. But it wasn't just the whispers. The house had started to act as if it had a mind of its own. Doors that had been closed would open in the middle of the night. Lights would flicker and burn out without reason. Items would move. Objects that Claire and John had placed in one room were found in another. John didn't believe her. He thought she was just stressed from the move. "It's an old house, Claire," he would say. "The wiring's bad and the floors creak. It's natural for things to shift. You're just tired." But Claire knew it wasn't just the house settling. The house was alive. She could feel it breathing around her, its cold fingers touching her skin, its whispers clawing at her mind. One night, as Claire sat in the kitchen alone, she heard something from upstairs, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps like someone walking through the hall. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she grabbed a knife from the counter for protection. She crept upstairs, her breath shallow, her footsteps barely making a sound. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. There, standing in the middle of the hallway, was the silhouette of a little girl. Her back was turned, but Claire could see the outline of a doll in her hands. "Lila," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't turn around. Instead, it began to walk slowly down the hall, toward the bedroom. Claire's heart raced, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the floor. Before she could react, the figure vanished into thin air. Claire stood there for a moment, breathless. She turned quickly to the bedroom, but when she entered, John was still sound asleep, undisturbed. She was alone. The next day, Claire spent hours combing through the attic, searching for answers. She knew she needed to understand the full extent of the house's dark past, and she wasn't going to stop until she found it. The diary she had found in the basement was the key. She felt certain of it. She needed to know what had happened to Lila. As she sifted through old boxes filled with knickknacks and forgotten furniture, Claire found something else, an old chest, locked with a brass latch. She carefully pried it open with a screwdriver and found a stack of letters and documents, brittle with age. But there was something else at the bottom, a faded journal, its pages yellowed with time. The cover was made of soft leather, and the initials LB were embossed in gold on the front. Claire's hands trembled as she opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant, a beautiful cursive script, though the ink was starting to fade in places. October 4th, 1922. Father has locked me in again. He says it's for my own safety, but I know the truth. He's afraid of me. He says that I'm changing, but I'm not. I'm just scared. He says I'm special, but I don't feel special. I feel trapped. Every night I hear things in the walls, scratching, screaming. Sometimes I can't tell if it's inside my head or from the house itself, but whatever it is, I feel it getting closer. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. The entries became darker, more frantic. October 10th, 1922. Father is gone. He's been gone for days now. The house is so quiet, too quiet. I can hear the whispers. They're not my imagination. I'm not crazy. I know I'm not. I hear them every night calling to me. They want me to join them. The house wants me to join them. The final entry sent a chill down Claire's spine. October 15th, 1922. I hear them now. They're in the walls. They're inside me. They've been waiting for me to be ready. I don't want to go. I don't want to stay. I don't want to be trapped here anymore. The last sentence was scratched out, as if someone, perhaps Lila herself, had tried to erase the words. But the words were still there. Lila had never left the house. Her spirit had been trapped, just as Claire's had been. That night, everything changed. Claire lay in bed, her mind racing as she thought about the journal and the terrible truth it revealed. Lila's spirit had never moved on. And now, something else was awakening in the house. Something darker. Something that had been hidden for too long. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. Claire shivered as cold air wrapped around her. The whispers began again, louder now, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. Claire. The voice was unmistakable. It was Lila's voice. The room felt suffocating, the walls pressing in. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and desperate. "Help me!" Claire stumbled out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She ran into the hallway, but the house was dark, and the shadows were thick. The whispers followed her, a constant, overwhelming presence. It was as if the house itself was alive, pulling her towards something she couldn't see but knew was waiting. "Claire." The voice was now a rasp, a dry whisper coming from the basement. Without thinking, Claire rushed to the basement door. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. Her hand shook as she turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. Claire stepped inside, her heart hammering in her chest, and then she saw it. In the corner of the room Lila stood, her back turned, holding the doll. The doll's eyes were wide and vacant, and its smile was too twisted, too unnatural. "You came back," Lila whispered. "Lila." Claire's legs went weak and she sank to her knees. Lila's figure turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes hollow and full of sorrow. The room seemed to grow colder as the ghostly figure approached. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never meant for you to suffer. I didn't know, I didn't understand." Lila's voice was soft, almost gentle. "It's too late. You cannot save me now." Claire's heart broke as she watched Lila's form flicker, like an image out of focus. She reached out desperate, but Lila stepped back. "I've been waiting for someone to help me," Lila whispered. "But no one ever stays. The house won't let them leave." The walls around Claire seemed to close in tighter. The air grew heavier, suffocating her. The whispers swirled around her head like a storm. "I'm so sorry," Claire cried, her voice breaking. "I can't help you." The last whisper Claire heard before everything went black was a soft, childlike voice. "Then you're just like them, trapped." When Claire awoke, she was lying on the basement floor. The house was silent. No whispers, no tapping. The air was still. She blinked, her vision blurry, and looked around. The shadows were gone, and the house seemed to breathe easier. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and turned to look at the doll. It was gone. John rushed to her side, his face pale with worry. "Claire, are you okay?" "I think it's over," she whispered. "I think we can leave." And so they did. They left the house behind, the nightmare finally over. Months passed, and Claire and John found a new home, one that felt light and peaceful. But even as they settled in, Claire sometimes heard the faintest whispers in the walls, carried on the wind. "You didn't leave me." Claire glanced at John, her heart heavy with the knowledge that some things, some spirits, could never truly be free. The house was quiet now, eerily silent. John and Claire had left behind the place that had once seemed so full of promise and possibility, but it had turned into something dark and suffocating. They tried to go on with their lives, but the memories of the house, the whispers, the haunting presence, stayed with them like a shadow. The nightmares didn't stop. Claire would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, still hearing the whispers calling her name. Sometimes she would see the flicker of a shadow, just out of her peripheral vision. Other times, she would wake to find herself in the same dark room where she had last seen Lila's ghost, standing alone with the doll in her hands. But it was the small, inexplicable things that scared Claire the most. The faintest whispers in the walls of their new home, the strange drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, the old picture frame in their living room, an old family portrait that Claire had never bought, but found mysteriously hanging on their wall one morning. The eyes of the figures in the picture seemed to follow her wherever she went. John tried to reassure her, but he too had started to feel it, the unease, the sense of being watched. He tried to convince himself that it was all in Claire's head, that the stress of the haunting had caused them both to see things that weren't there. But deep down, John couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting. One night, as they sat in silence, the air thick with tension, they heard it again, the whispers. This time it wasn't from the walls. It came from the basement. "John," Claire whispered, fear rising in her chest. "It's happening again." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of dread and disbelief. "I thought it was over," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I can't shake this feeling. It's like it never left." They stood together, hand in hand, as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening. Claire felt as though the house was alive again, pulling her toward the basement where it all began. As they reached the door, they stopped, staring at the dark passage leading down into the depths. The air was cold, suffocating, and the whispers had turned into words. "Come down. Come back. It's not over." John turned to Claire, his face pale. "We can't go down there. We can't open that door again." But Claire's gaze remained fixed on the basement door, and she realized then, she knew what they had to do. The house had been pulling them back because they hadn't finished what they started. The curse wasn't broken. Lila's spirit was still trapped. "We have to end it," Claire said, her voice firm. John's face crumpled with hesitation, but he nodded. "We have no choice." With trembling hands, Claire opened the basement door. The basement was as it had been all those months ago, dark, damp, and still. The air was thick with the smell of old stone and dust. But something had changed. The house felt more alive than ever, as if it had been waiting for them to return. Claire descended the stairs slowly, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and John followed close behind. As they reached the bottom, Claire felt the temperature drop, a biting cold that sent shivers down her spine. She could feel the weight of something watching them, an oppressive force that seemed to wrap itself around them like a heavy blanket. And then, they saw it. At the far end of the basement, illuminated by the dim, flickering light above, stood the chalk circle. It was the same one Claire had seen before, around the doll, around the symbols. But now the circle seemed to pulse like a living thing, the lines glowing faintly with an eerie energy. In the center of the circle stood the doll, but it wasn't just a doll anymore. It had changed. The porcelain was cracked, and the eyes were no longer vacant. They glowed with an unnatural light, and the smile on its face was twisted, stretched into something grotesque. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The whispers grew louder. "Join me, Claire. Join me forever." The figure in the circle began to shift. The shadows surrounding it coalesced into a dark, twisted form, Lila. But she wasn't the same as before. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth stretched wide in a grin that sent terror flooding through Claire's chest. She was no longer a frightened little girl. She was something darker, something far more dangerous. Lila's voice was hollow, empty, as she reached out from the shadows. "You can never leave. You are mine now. The house demands it." Claire felt the walls closing in, the house pulling her toward the circle, the ground beneath her feet seeming to shift as if it were alive. She tried to move, but it was as if the very air held her in place. "We have to stop her," Claire said, her voice shaking. "We have to break the cycle." John took a step back, his hand trembling, but his resolve hardening. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the journal, the one they had found in the hidden room all those months ago, the one that detailed Lila's suffering, the one that had described how she was trapped here, unable to leave. It was their only chance. "We have to finish what we started," John said, his voice steady now. "We have to release her, for good." Claire nodded, and together they began to recite the words they had found in the journal, the words that would release Lila's spirit, break the house's curse. As they spoke the final words, the house seemed to shake violently. The walls groaned, and the whispers turned into a scream. Lila's figure in the circle writhed, her face contorting in agony as the spell took hold. Her voice grew louder, frantic, but Claire and John continued, their voices strong and unwavering. Finally, with one last scream, the house went still. The air cleared, the whispers faded, and the oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted. Lila's presence was gone. The basement was silent. Claire and John stood there, their bodies shaking with exhaustion. They had done it, they had broken the curse. The house, once alive with torment, now felt cold and lifeless. The shadows had receded, the whispers were gone. Lila was finally at peace. For a long time neither of them spoke. The house felt empty now, desolate, abandoned. They had freed it, and in doing so, they had freed themselves. "It's over," Claire whispered, her voice hoarse. John looked around, his face pale. "We're free." But even as they walked toward the stairs, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in her. The house had taken its toll. The weight of everything they had experienced would stay with them, a shadow they couldn't outrun. As they left the house, Claire looked back one last time. In the distance, just behind the windows, she thought she saw a shadow flicker. But it was gone. John and Claire moved on, starting fresh in a new home far away from Black Hollow. They tried to live a normal life, but the memories of the house never fully left them. Every creak of a floorboard, every strange sound in the night, reminded them of the darkness that had once consumed them. One night, months after they had moved, Claire sat in their living room, staring at the empty space in front of her. She could almost hear the whispers again, just beneath the surface. And as the wind howled outside, Claire knew that the house would never truly be gone. It had imprinted itself on her soul, a part of her that would always remain. Some spirits, some darkness, could never truly be left behind. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I'm still here."